I was born in Georgetown, South Carolina, January the 2nd, 1915, on Wood Street. My father was a letter carrier. My mother, at that time, was a homemaker. I'm the oldest of 4 girls that my mother had. And my name was Florida. My second sister's name is Garner. My third sister's name is Hilda. And the fourth, Zelda. And there's a joke in the family. We lived around the corner from the Howards. They lived on Front Street near the Fords. And we had an older sister. My father had been married before. And one day this older sister took Garner and me around to the Howards. So one of them said, why hello, Louisiana. And at that time, Garner's name was not Garner, it was Georgia. Why hello, Louisiana, how Florida and Georgia? And when she came back and told Papa, he didn't think it was so funny. So he changed Georgia's name to Garner. So, and then after that, all of the girls' names ended in A. Florida, Garner, Hilda, Zelda. And later we had another sister whose name was Twyla. But the girls in the family have kept up that tradition, and their daughters' names end in A. My mother, bless her heart, my mother died when I was 9. So unlike my other sisters, I do have some memories of her. They were both very strict with us, very careful with us. And I think I was an exasperating child because I was always asking, why? Why? And I think I whyed my poor mother to death. She was an excellent cook. My father told us later that when we were born, he and Mama had agreed that if they had girls, she would discipline the girls. And if they had boys, he would discipline the boys. But he had nothing but girls. And then Mama left him. And he did discipline us, bless his heart. But I remember every day we would have to take a nap. And again, why? Why? And there was a special room in the back that we were put in for this nap. And just a little before I was 9, I don't remember, my family moved from Wood Street to High Market Street. My father's father had owned a livery stable. It was really a family livery stable, the livery stable at that time in Georgetown. And we moved to what had been the family homestead site. Papa had bought his sisters and brother out and built a new house there. And I remember when the men were building the house that we went one day and there was a mulberry tree in the yard. I don't see mulberry trees anymore. And the mulberries were ripe. And one of the workmen brought a hat full of mulberries and gave them to us. They were the most delicious berries I have ever tasted, and I've never tasted berries so just delicious since. And I don't know that I've even had any mulberries since then. I don't see any mulberry trees around. But we lived next door to the Duncan Memorial Methodist Church on High Market Street. And I remember in moving into that house, Papa had a room that was designated as the library, full of books, and it was beaver boarded. Now, Papa always dabbled in real estate, collecting rentals for people, and sometimes selling other people's, possessions for, not possessions, but property for them. And he had this great roll-top desk in there. And I used to like to sit at his desk and go through it, and bless his heart, if I had a child who went through my desk the way I went through my father's desk, I would warm their bottoms. But I was always curious. I knew where every pigeonhole was, where every drawer was, but he was a very loving, tolerant, strict person. But he was a wonderful father. I think he sacrificed a great deal for us and was panic-stricken when my mother died and he was left with 4 girls. He was very active in what was then the Building and Loan Association that Negro men had organized in Georgetown. And I remember among them was Mr. J.B. Brockington and I.J. McCartry. I remember those two. And they had an office on Front Street upstairs over what was then the Crawley store on the corner of Front and King. And the night that my mother died, I remember I was always very easily awakened. I was awakened by this noise, and I woke up, and my grandmother was crying, and what's the matter? What's the matter? And I heard her say to the doctor, "She gone yet, Doc?" And I don't know what the doctor said. But then she asked the same question again, and he must have said yes, and oh, she just burst out. Well, then the noise was so much, it awakened all of us, and they got us up and dressed us. And 3 o'clock in the morning, my father left the house with the 4 of us. I was 9. Garner was 8, Hilda was 7, and Zelda was 5. 2 little girls on either side of him walking down the street, and went to the office. And I remember climbing the steps because the entrance was in the back, and going up there. And again, I always enjoyed going there with Papa because you would sit around, and while he was working, I was typewriting, and I realized now there was nothing but banging on the typewriters and looking at everything that, was there. And Papa himself was crying, and he went there and started working, and we were just, I don't know, not in the way, because he did not consider us in the way, but I've often thought that that was his way of expressing his extreme futility. What was he going to do with 4 girls? And he courted several different ladies, but no one seemed anxious to take on 4 girls. Neither would I. But there was a teacher here from Abbeville, South Carolina, Joe Willie Taylor. She was interested, and he was interested in her because she had the reputation of loving children and being very good with children. And Zelda, when school opened, Mama died in April, but when school opened, Zelda was old enough to go to school, and Zelda was in her room. And Zelda used to have stomach aches. So she would take Zelda home with her, but come by the house and tell the lady who was there taking care of us, tell Mr. Jackson to come and get Zelda. I took her home with me. So Mr. Jackson would go and get Zelda. And that happened until Papa became interested in her, and when he asked her to marry, she said yes, and she became the mother of these 4 girls. Now, my grandmother had been living with us during the last months of my mother's life, but after my mother died, a short time after that, she moved out because her idea of how to rear children and my father's idea of how to rear children were very, very different. But my father was always very careful of her and very, concerned about her, but she did not live with us after that. Grandmama spoiled us. She didn't want us to do anything. And Papa was determined that we would have to be reared knowing how to work and what to do, and to be responsible for keeping home as home. He was a very organized person, and as we grew older, all of the work in the house, he divided it, and each of us had a week to do different things. You had a week to cook. You had a week to get up in the mornings and set the table and keep the downstairs clean. You had a week to clean up upstairs, and you had a week to clean the yards. And each of us, regardless of age, had a week to do each of these things. And Grandmama didn't think that we should work. Papa was determined that we would recognize that you made home, that you kept home, and that you had to work to do it. We were about 3 blocks away from the school. Let's see, down the street 1 block, across the street another block, approximately 3 blocks away from school. And when I started to school, we had first grade, advanced first grade, and then second grade. And my first grade teacher and advanced first grade teacher and second grade teacher were all friends of the family. In fact, we, in a small town, you knew everybody. And I remember we had these hard seats, and just sitting at that seat and kicking my legs back and forth, and it made a very pleasant sound. And when she told me to stop, I couldn't understand what's wrong with her. She didn't hear the music in that sound, and why would she? But she had me to understand, you might be my cousin, but you will be just like everybody else in this class. But I loved her. And then in the second grade, Miss Lily Frazier. Now, I think we had excellent teachers. They were dedicated, they were concerned, and they were concerned with developing the total person. And they made learning very exciting. Now, my mother died when I when I was in the 3rd grade. And our school at that time, we had the school building, and then we had other places around the school in which we met, halls and buildings. The Barnes building had some of the some of the classes, and we were across the street from the school building in a hall upstairs. But I loved school, and I loved the teachers, and I loved learning. The seats were hard, I remember that. Now, high school in Georgetown, again, we had very good teachers. Miss Bertha Sawyer was my English teacher, was our English teacher. She taught English to all of the high school classes. And Professor Howard, if I remember correctly, taught the math. But Ms. Sawyer made you love learning and challenged you and disciplined you. And I immensely enjoyed her classes. But when I was about the 10th grade, when I was 15, Papa took me out of the school here and sent me to Morris College. Now, Morris College had a high school department and the college department, and I went into the 11th grade, I think, because I had 2 years of high school at Morris College. But Papa moved me because my stepmother was not all sweetness and light, but neither was I. And he sent me first, and then the next year he sent all of us, the 4 of us, away to boarding school. Now, my sisters, Zelda and Hilda, went to Mather School. Yeah, they went to the Buford Mather. And Garner and I went to Morris College. And I finished high school at Morris and went back the next year as a freshman in college. All of life was lived right there on the campus. You had a roommate. You had I think we had chapel every day. And in addition to that, on Wednesday nights we had prayer meeting. And it was a great thing to try to get out of going to prayer meeting. And when the time would come for prayer meeting, the Dean of Women would take us over to the chapel building for prayer meeting, but she would always check to see who was there and who was not there. And it was great fun to hide under the bed, to hide in the closet, and to hide away from her. That was fun for us. But we were exasperating, I know, because she knew where to look for you, and very seldom did you get away with that. In the evenings after dinner, the Dean of Women for our building would stay over until the kitchen and dining room were all put, to right. Mm-hmm. And before she would get over there, in our reception room, we had a large reception room, somebody would be playing the piano and we would have great fun dancing. Now, you were not supposed to dance at a Baptist school at that time. And oh, we would just be dancing, and someone would be standing at the door to watch when she's coming. Here she comes, here she comes. And by the time she got there, we'd be sitting around talking to each other, sitting around singing. But she knew that we had been dancing, and we felt that we had put one over on her. But I'm sure we never put anything on her. We used to call her, she was a very dignified lady. And her first name was Grace. And behind her back, we used to call her Aunt Grace. But she instilled very fine qualities in us that at that time we did not have sense enough to appreciate. And then after you've grown up and look back, you realize what a jewel she truly was. After graduation, I got a job teaching in Andrews, South Carolina. And I taught the 5th and 6th grades. And my first class, I shall always remember, but it's an experience that I shall always be very grateful for, the experience of teaching at that grade level. Because at that grade level, the children love you and they want you to know it. And you feel it, and it gives you something. I don't think at any other grade level, I think after the 5th and 6th grades, they begin to suspect teachers, and they begin to feel that there's not that kind of love after the 5th and 6th grades. And I enjoyed that so very, very much. Now in that class, I had a number of interesting students that I will never forget. There was a big boy whose name I have forgotten. I'm glad I've forgotten his name. He had been what we call left back, which means that he had not been promoted to the next grade level. And he was much larger than the other students in the class. And everyone was saying he was difficult. The teachers who'd had him before, the students. And I remember on one occasion he did something in class, and I reprimanded him. And then I reprimanded him, and he just sat there. And I spoke to him again. He looked up at me. You better let me be good to you while I'm good to you. And I looked at him and smiled. And I said, now who are you trying to impress, me or the others? But just in case you don't know it, your classmates who are laughing and egging you on, they are laughing at you, not with you. And why don't we fool them and not let them laugh? And he began to soften, and he did what I asked him to do. And I never had any trouble out of him. Never had any trouble out of him after that. There were 3 or 4 little boys in the class who were just dolls. And we, the other teachers, all of the teachers at that time, lived at the home of the principal. We didn't have a teachery, but something had happened in the community before I went there. And that year, the community people had said that they would not take any teachers into their homes. So then the principal had to take all of the teachers, or did take all of the teachers who were from out of town. And there were about 4 or 5 of us who lived there. And some evenings we would go to the movies. And I remember going to the movies, and these 3 little boys, they would sometimes be there, and they'd come and sit near us as though they were guarding us and taking care of us. It was just a delightful kind of experience. But I enjoyed working in Andrews. I only worked there 2 years. And at the end of that time, I went to Washington to visit my aunt, my father's sister, Octavia and her family. And while I was there, my cousin Theopa suggested that I might try to see if I could get an NYA scholarship, because that was in the years of the Depression. And I did make application for an NYA scholarship and got a scholarship to Howard. So I stayed in Washington and enrolled at Howard to major in history. And Morris College was not an accredited college, and I did not have the required courses to major in history. So for the first year that I was at Howard, I took the courses at the undergraduate level that I should have had in order to be accepted as a history major. And I remember when I went to enroll, the lady in the registrar's office was acquainted with Morris College because she had married a young man in that town. And when I said I was from Morris College, she looked at me with great disdain. That's not even a decent high school. And I looked at her, and I was accepted provisionally. They did not accept me at first as a graduate student. It would be dependent on the quality of work that I did. So from that moment on, my second home was a congressional library. Now, I was in the Depression, and I didn't have the money to buy my books. I would go to the congressional library on Saturday and Sundays and spend the day at the library. And I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. And I took a course from Dr. Rayford Logan, The French Revolution, and he was a wonderful teacher. But I remember sitting in the library and reading, and it was just wonderful to put in an order for books, and the pages would bring the books to you, and the day went quickly in each instant. And when we had the first examination, when we got our papers back, he had written at the bottom of my paper the highest mark in the class. And I think he said as much to the class. And the brash young man who later became my husband came up to me and said, the highest mark in the class. No woman has ever made a better grade than mine. And I just laughed at him, because there was really nothing to say. But after that, by the end of the first semester, I was accepted as a graduate student. And I went to Howard in '38, the fall of '38, and graduated in '41, and with the master's degree in history. But I laugh at myself, because when I decided to major in history, what I always wanted to do, I always wanted to be a writer. And I wanted to become the foreign correspondent for the New York Times. Can you imagine? And I had written to their school of journalism relative to admission, and had received information that I would need to choose an area of specialization, something like political science or history to major in at the undergraduate level. So then I decided on history. Prior to that, I had been an English major. And when I graduated from Morris College, I graduated with a major in English, not in history. And when I decided to go to Howard, when I was accepted at Howard, I switched to history. That's why I had to take all of these courses at the undergraduate level in order to become a history major. The first job that I got after I left Howard was as a messenger in one of the government agencies. It was in Social Security. And the wife of John R. Commons was at that time the head of the division that I worked in. And shortly thereafter, we went into the war. And with the war agencies being established, there was a possibility for getting a better job. And I made application at the War Department in their Office of Dependency Benefits and became an adjudicator to adjudicate the cases for servicemen's dependents. And I switched from Social Security over to the War Department. And that division was moved from Washington to Newark. The Prudential Life Insurance building had just been completed, and they were using it for the Office of Dependency Benefits. And my husband, we were still courting at that time, but he was also hired into this new agency. And when the agency went to Newark, we were married in New Jersey. And I had a very interesting experience in New Jersey because I lived in Newark. No, I worked in Newark, but I lived in Montclair because when the agency went there, the concern was, where were these government people going to live? And there was a friend from New Jersey who worked in the same agency, and she was helping with assigning places to live. And she sent me to the home of Jessie Fawcett. Now, Jessie Fawcett was one of the early distinguished Negro writers. And she had taught school in Philadelphia and in New York. And when she taught school in New York, she lived in Montclair. Now, she was no longer teaching when I knew her, but she and her husband were living in Montclair. And this friend told me, she said, they had asked the people in that section to take the government workers, into their homes. And the Harrises, she was married to a Mr. Harris, was among the people who said that they would take folk. She said, Florida, I didn't know anybody else that I could send to her house but you. And that's where I went to live. And I considered that very significant and became very fond of the Harrises. Mr. Harris was an insurance agent, and Jessie was a retired school teacher and a distinguished author. After John and I married, we went to live in Jersey City. Now, Jersey City had just completed project housing on Fremont Street. And instead of using it exclusively for what it had been built for, they let some of the government people who had come to the section there have apartments. So our first apartment was there. And it was fun fixing it up and fun commuting from Jersey City to Newark. And then my son was born in Jersey City. And it seems it was almost providential that we would be in Jersey City, because at that time, Jersey City had the Margaret Haig Maternity Hospital, which was one of the best maternity hospitals in the country. And in the early days of my pregnancy, I had an extremely difficult time, and had an excellent doctor, Lena Edwards, who was also a graduate of Howard University and took, I think, special interest in us because both my husband and I were graduates of Howard. After Robert was born, I got an offer to teach at Morris College. And I was hired to teach English, and my husband was hired to teach political science. And we taught at Morris College for 2 years. And then John went back to school because he only had the bachelor's degree. He didn't have the master's degree. And when he went back to school, Dr. Rayford Logan, bless his heart, had been impressed with me as a student when I was a student at Howard. So he made it possible for me to teach in the history department while John was a graduate student in the political science department. And then after John graduated from political science, he went to work for labor. He'd always been interested in that. And he became, he worked with the CIO. And about that time, we separated. And then when we separated, we were living in Jersey City then, though, when we separated, because he stayed in New York and I stayed in Jersey City. And of course, my main concern was to get a job. And my sister Zelda came and got my son Robert and brought him to Georgetown. And then I started looking for a job. And again, I had a great streak of wonderful luck, because when I went to the employment agency, I was interviewed by a Mrs. Axtell, A-X-T-E-L-L, whose husband was on the faculty at New York University. And she said, well, now I can get you a job at NYU. And if I get you a job at NYU, you can work in the day and go to school at night. And if you'd like, work toward another degree. Well, that pleased me greatly, because I felt that I would like to teach at the college level again, and that would be a more controlled atmosphere and climate in which to rear my son. So I was hired in the Bursar's collection office at NYU, and I worked until 5 o'clock, and then went to school from 6 to 10. and I registered in the graduate school to major in history. But at first I was interested in the United Nations program. And at that time, NYU had a United Nations program. And I registered first in that program until I realized that that wouldn't take me anywhere that I wanted to go or that I was in a position to go. And then I concentrated in history. I moved from Jersey City to New York City in the Village because across the street from the university was the Judson, a residence hall for women, and I was able to get a room there. So for 2 winters, as I remember, I worked at NYU and went to school in the evenings, and I enjoyed it. I didn't have any money, but I enjoyed the learning and enjoyed the association with the other students. I had a good friend who was working on a doctorate in education and tried to interest me in a doctorate in education, but no, I wanted history. And NYU had a place that you could register for employment. And Gladys was going one day to register, and she said, "Florida, come and go with me." Well, oh, shucks, I went with her. I knew I was not ready for employment, not nearly ready, and she was almost ready. And I did register reluctantly. And shortly thereafter, I got a telegram from an ex-classmate at Howard University who had become president of a school in Texas. He had become president of Butler College, a Baptist school in Tyler, Texas. And he offered me the position of Dean of Women and instructor in social science. Well, instructor in social science interested me, and that could take me where I wanted to go. Dean of Women, I was not particularly interested in being Dean of Women. He offered me the magnificent salary of $200 a month and room and board. So I communicated with my father, and he immediately sent me the money to go to Texas. I had an aunt that lived in New York, and her husband had a friend who worked for one of the airlines. And on his pass, I was able to get a reduced ticket. And I left New York at night, in the middle, took a night flight, and flew to Dallas. Love Airfield, I shall always remember it. And got there early morning or late night, I've forgotten which, but I remember the dining room was closed, and I was so hungry. And I asked about it, and they were kind enough to feed me in that great big dining hall in the dark all by myself, and I was so happy. And the president of the school had sent a student from Tyler to from Tyler to Dallas, and he picked me up at the airport and took me to Butler College. And when I went to Butler and saw the school and saw what I would be expected to do, I was initially very disappointed, and I would have walked back home if I could. But then I had no alternative but to stay. and people were so kind. And I learned not only to like it, but to just love it, to love the school, to love the work, to love the students. And I stayed there for 2 years. But the time that I was there, Robert was still here in Georgetown with my family. And then my father wrote and told me that, well, he thought perhaps he'd like to ask if I would let him adopt Robert. Oh, no. I told him, no, sir, that I would have to rear him. So I resigned in Butler and came here and taught English at the Howard High School in Georgetown for 1 year. And then I received communication from Jarvis Christian College in Hawkins, Texas, offering me a position as director of student life and again instructor in social science, and the instructor in social science. And I took that position and came and went to Jarvis Christian College. I think I worked at Jarvis 2 years, and I left Jarvis and went to Texas College, which was a Methodist school in Tyler. And I stayed at Texas College, I think, 5 years. And my son, I took Robert with me when I went to Jarvis. But I loved Texas and loved the Texans. Robert finished high school in Tyler. And about the time that he finished high school in Tyler, I was hired at Prairie View A&M University at Prairie View, Texas, to teach history. And I stayed there until I retired, stayed beyond retirement because I retired in 1979 and did not leave until 1988. I taught part-time. I became an adjunct professor in the Houston Community College after retirement. After I retired here, I started volunteering at Brook Green Gardens, and that I enjoyed. I became a docent and for the sculpture gardens and for the wildlife section. And they started offering courses, and I was asked to teach a course in the history of the Negro in Georgetown County. And my reply was that I would be glad to if David Drayton would team teach with me. Now, David Drayton had been the last Negro principal of the Howard High School here. And after retirement, he had become very active with the Committee for the Preservation of Negro History. And they had done research and had established a museum. So he was the person who was really working at preserving the history of the Negro in Georgetown County. And they said yes, and I asked him if he would, and he said yes. And we taught that course there 3 or 4 years. And then later, we taught it at Artworks with Linda Ketron, and that's where we have most recently offered it. But that has been very exciting because many people who are moving into the section want to know about the section and know about the history of the section. And most of the people are people or retirees who have come here to live. And it has made it, and it is a very interesting section, because whatever people have done, somebody here has done it. Someone among the retirees. So they come from a variety of backgrounds with different kinds of expertise and with intellectual curiosity. And it's just been very interesting. One of the things that would be very helpful is what is now being done in the scholarship. When I was a student, the history of the Negro in South Carolina and the history of South Carolina was, well, there was not a great deal in the scholarship. Now there's been a great deal of intellectual curiosity, and a great deal has been written, and a great deal is being written, and it's still just scratching the surface. And it's a section that is very rich in history. The people in the section have a quiet dignity, and intellectually they are very smart and have made outstanding contributions wherever they have lived in a very quiet way, and not a great deal has been said about it. But I think it would be well if something was done about that. Now they have with the with KO, they have what they call the Dream Keepers, and for a time every year they would elect people as Dream Keepers. And I understand that this year they are going to do that, but for a while they had stopped. But they came from very selected sections in Africa that had highly developed cultures, and it is reflected in the quality of people that are here and that have been here. The first congressman, Joseph Rainey, was a Georgetownian, and during the period of Reconstruction, they held many different offices. I would just say that the half has not yet been told, and someone needs to come along and do the research and pull it together. Christmas was always a time of great excitement because Santa Claus was coming, and we believed in Santa Claus. And I remember you could smell Christmas long before it came. There were smells associated with Christmas, the fruit, the cakes. My mama would make cakes, I remember, and put them aside for Christmas. And then Christmas Eve night, we would always go to bed early because we wanted to get up early to see what Santa Claus had left. And then it would seem almost as soon as daylight struck, we were tumbling down those steps to see what Santa Claus had left. And that was a time of great excitement and of much sharing, because Santa Claus was always very generous with us. And then people would go from house to house visiting And when you would go to different houses, they would serve you cake, different cakes, and fruit and candy and nuts. And I can remember there were older girls in the community who would come and bring gifts. And one of them that I remember so well was Catherine Pauley. Catherine Pauley. Her father, they lived on High Market Street, just about where James Carolina now lives. And I remember particularly one Christmas, she brought us this book of paper dolls. Now, paper dolls were very important. You could cut the dolls out and cut out all the different clothes for the dolls and dress these dolls up. Another time she brought storybooks, but the exchange of gifts and trying to be good so that Santa Claus would be sure to come was very, very important. I have a friend who laughs at me and refers to him as your one child, Florida, you and your one child. But he was born in Jersey City, as I have said. And then his father and I separated when he was 6. He came to South Carolina and lived several years with my family on High Market Street while I considered myself getting ready to make for him the kind of home that I hoped to. And I had felt that working in a college would give a controlled environment. And the first school that he went to with me was in Hawkins, Texas. And he was in elementary school at that time. And then we went to Tyler, Texas. And the school at Tyler was a very good school. The principal was Mr. Hilliard, the father of Asa Hilliard. And he was an excellent principal and had an excellent school. And he graduated from high school there. And he came to Howard in his freshman year. You have dreams about what you want to do for your children, the kind of home you want to establish, the things you want to do for them. And the breakup of the marriage and it took me a little while to get myself together. And my family, bless them, was right there, helping and holding Robert and me in position. And Robert married very young. He was a sophomore in college when he got married. But he worked full-time and went to school. And I used to feel so badly. I said, dear child, he hasn't had any childhood. He hasn't had the time to just be a young man and enjoy it. But he has retired early because he has now retired. And hopefully he can catch up with some of that time when he had to be a responsible adult very early. But I was very proud and pleased of what he did and what he has done with his life. But I have not had the time to spend with him that I've wanted to, because in college teaching, you're always preparing, and you must, because you must keep up with the scholarship, And the kinds of schools that I worked in, you didn't have few classes. I always had 5 classes. And that's preparation, evaluation, preparation, evaluation. But I enjoyed the work. I loved the work. Now, I hoped that in rearing Robert, I would not rear him to be a mother's boy. I kept pushing him away from me to be independent and to stand on his own. And I sometimes think that he didn't understand that that was why I was acting like that. Not for any other reason. And he is very independent and has done well, but I just wish that I could have reared him in a setting in which I could have been closer to him. I have 5 grandchildren. The young woman that Robert married when he was in his sophomore year, she was a freshman. And I shall always remember I was still working in Tyler at that time. And we had come to Georgetown for Christmas. And that Christmas he was very quiet. Didn't even go out much. And then he told me about this pretty girl that he had met. And he said, "Mother, now you may as well make up your mind because this is it." I said, "Honey, I don't have any mind to make up. That will be your choice, and whoever you choose, it's all right with me." They had 2 children. Now, Cheryl did not go back to school after the baby. And Robert continued in school and at work, in school and at work. But they were separated early. I think their son must have perhaps been about 6 when they went their separate ways. And he was just devastated. But again, I listened. I was not sympathetic. I remembered that when my husband and I had separated and I was living in New York away from home, and I wrote Papa and told him about it. No word of sympathy, no shoulder to cry on. The only he wrote and said to me, "Be a woman. I have reared all my girls to be ladies." And of course, that was all he needed to say. Because from then, I was determined that I was going to rear my son. I was going to educate my son. But whatever I did, it was always with the help of my family. But he was a very easy son to rear. Very easy son to rear. I remember when he was finishing high school in Tyler and getting ready to come to Howard, one day he looked at me because it seems as though he realized that I would be there alone. He said, "Mother, we'll have to write the Lonely Hearts about you." And I looked at him and smiled and said to myself, nobody's looking for anybody fat and 40. And there will be no Lonely Hearts. But he's been a very good son and very responsible with his family. First, I have an insatiable love for history. I have never wanted administration. I have wanted only to teach history. And the energy and time that one puts in administration would steal away the time that I would need for study and for reading and for organization. That is why I got out of being the Dean of Women as soon as I possibly could, the Director of Student Life as soon as I possibly could. And then when I was at Prairie View, at one time, they had started teaching geography in the department that I worked in. And I got an offer that would permit me to attend Chico University in California to work on a degree in geography. And I asked the president if I could accept the position, and he said yes. But then when the time came for school to open, he said for me, he said, "Ms. Yeldell, I just wanted to show you what you would be making next year." I said, "Oh no, I'm not going to be here next year. You remember I'm to go to Chico." "Oh, well, we have decided that we don't think that would be good at your age." I said, "I'm sorry. I have given my word, and I'm going to Chico." Well, he said, "The help that we had said that we could give, we will not give." I said, "That's quite all right. I'm going to Chico." So I went to Chico for 2 years, and they gave me what they called a lectureship. And I taught at Chico State for 2 years in the geography department while I worked toward a degree in geography. And after the degree in geography, I went back to Prairie View to work again. And at that time, the administration wanted me to accept the position as the chairman of the department that I was in, and I did not want it. There has never been a job that I have wanted less. But I could not really refuse it because that's the position they had placed me in. And I had come back from school poor. And I think for a year or two, I went through the motions of being the chairman of that department, but I did not want it. I did not ever want it. I did not want administration. And I guess that seems to say that I was without ambition, but what I wanted to do was in another direction. I wanted to do deep reading and deep study, and hopefully in time to write, but I never had the time because with 5 classes, it's just a matter of impossibility. Georgetown, like the whole of the South, has transformed. Physically, it has changed. Spiritually, I don't think it has changed. I think there was always a fine, deep feeling of goodwill. And it has just moved into another phase and kind of expression. One of the things that I was most impressed with when I came back is the large number of young women who are in responsible positions in Georgetown with that same quiet dignity that I referred to, that is a part of the people of this town. I'm, oh, and when I look at them, I'm just as proud as I can be. I look at Carletha Rudolph in the library. I look at Miss Button on the school board. I look at Alma White. I look at Beulah White. I look at Lily Jean Johnson. I look at, what is Wiles's daughter's name? Barbara Hewell, outstanding businesswoman. But the one thing that disturbs me a little, I remember at one conference that I attended, someone pointed out that the real challenge for advancement in the South is for Negro men, because it is almost as though there is a subtle force that would hold them back, that would distort them, that would misrepresent them. And I looked at that, and it is true. It's very true. And then at that very same conference, it was pointed out that what has been done is that Negro women have been pushed and advanced over and against Negro men in a subtle infight to control the man and divert him out of place. And because of that, I have never permitted myself to be projected into the position of fighting and contending with any Negro man for position, because that is not what is needed. Whatever you can do without contending and fighting for it. You just quietly go on being yourself and permitting that other person to be himself. I had the great good fortune to be reared in a Christian home.
Okay.
My mother, one of the things that I remember about her was that every night before we went to bed, she read us a Bible story. And then afterwards, we would discuss it. Then we would kneel, my sisters and I, at my mother's knee and say the Lord's Prayer. And at the end of the prayer, we would go through the blessings for the whole family. Bless Mama, bless Papa, bless, 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 bless. Mm-hmm. After my mother's death, of course, that stopped. There was no one to do that. But I attended a Baptist school, and that undergirded the religious education. But while I was in school at Morris College, I had a teacher who was a Christian Scientist. And I used to have chronic indigestion. And the teachers lived in the same residence halls with the students, the female teachers, with the female students. So I remember I lived on the same floor as this teacher. And whenever I was sick, she would know it, and she would come in, to see how I was feeling, what she could do. So she told me, she said, "Florida, you don't have to suffer like that." She said, "I'm going to let you read my book and tell you what happened to me." She said, "I used to have chronic indigestion like that." She said, "My mother sent me to college in Des Moines, Iowa, to Drake. And at that time, Negro students were not living in the residence hall, and I lived in the community. And this woman with whom I lived, I did not know was a Christian Scientist. And one night I had a very bad attack of indigestion and went downstairs and asked her if she would please call the doctor. She looked at me and said, no. The doctor hadn't been in her house in 25 years. She said, and I looked at her, and I could not wait to get back upstairs to write my mother and tell her she didn't know where she had sent me. She said, but I went to sleep when I got back upstairs. And the next morning, I was just fine. And when I came downstairs for breakfast, she was smiling. She said, I know you were disturbed when I replied the way I did. She said, but I'm a Christian Scientist. And she began telling her about Christian Science and the position of spiritual healing. And she said, now if you'd like, you may go with me to church at some time. And she started going to church with her. And she was impressed by the testimonies of healing that she heard. And in time, she became a Christian Scientist. She said, now, we are here at a Baptist school, so you cannot let anyone know that you are reading my book. So I read her copy of Science and Health periodically. She did not try to convert me. She did not say anything more. And I read the book, and over a period of time, I was completely healed. And I never had indigestion before. And I laugh and say now I could wake up in the middle of the night and eat boiled octopus, and nothing would hurt me. But I did not get to visit a Christian Science church until I went to Washington. And when I went to Washington and lived with my aunt for a time, I started attending the Christian Science church. And then when I was at NYU, I attended the Christian Science church there at Washington Square. And when I went to Texas, I attended the Christian Science church. And when I lived in New Jersey, I attended the Christian Science church. And it was while I was at NYU that I joined the Christian Science church. And ever since then, I've considered myself a student of Christian Science. I belong to the Christian Science church here at Pulleys Island, Litchfield. And I'm glad because the emphasis for me has been on developing spirituality. And it calls for constant study and constant application. And the constant study suits me because I think that's the thing that I'm particularly interested in. But Christian Science has given direction and meaning to my life since then. The only thing is that life is continuous unfoldment. And there's one thing that I have really learned, that in life there is no death. I've watched people, I've been associated with people, I've seen how they overcome the challenges in their lives. And in each instant, when something happens and you think the end has come, it's like going up the steps. And you just move from phase to phase and stage to stage of continuous unfoldment. And it isn't as though you have control of it. There's a line from Shakespeare that there is a divinity that controls our destiny. Rough hew them though we may. We think we do, But we are moved in accordance with the divine plan. I firmly believe that. And there is no death.